Chapter 3. An Imagined World of Symbols. We don't feel like players of games. We feel like heroes in stories. This is the illusion the brain spins for us. It makes us feel as if we are the hero at the centre of the universe, orbited by a cast of supporting characters. The goals of our lives are the plots that consume us as we overcome obstacles and strive nobly towards happy endings. This brain-generated story is self-serving, motivating and convincing in its tiniest details. It feels real because it's the only reality we know. But it's a lie. Nobody knows how this experience of consciousness is generated. But neuroscientists and psychologists agree that it's a fantastically simplistic and altered impression of true reality. It seems as if we have untrammelled access to the exterior world, that we look out of our heads at the space that surrounds our bodies. But this is not correct. We don't look out, we look in. Information from around us is picked up by our senses and encoded into billions of electrical pulses. The brain reads these pulses like a computer reads code, and uses them to conjure up our perception of reality. The disturbing truth is that all of this takes place inside the cramped bone vault of our skull. Life is a three-dimensional picture show, a story that we watch inside our heads. We hallucinate our world into being. Writes the neuroscientist Professor David Eagleman, what we call normal perception does not really differ from hallucinations, except that the latter are not anchored by external input. This anchoring of our perception into reality is the job of our senses. But our senses are not to be trusted. Ears, eyes, tongues, skin and noses don't supply sounds, colours, tastes, touches and smells to the brain, but a chattering stream of electrical pulses racing up the thick bundles of data cables that we call nerves. The experiences the brain makes of these pulses are acts of creation. Much of what seems inarguably real and true in the space around us is not. The actual world is monochrome and silent. Sounds, colours, tastes and smells exist only in the projection in our heads. What's actually out there are vibrating particles, floating chemical compounds, molecules and colourless light waves of varying lengths. Our perceptions of these phenomena are special effects in a brain-generated movie. And our senses can only detect the tiniest fraction of what's out there. Our eyes, for instance, are able to pick up less than 1/10 trillionth of the available light spectrum. So the brain creates our experience of the world. Next, it conjures us, the self at its centre. It is a hero maker, manufacturing both the illusion of self and its gripping narrative, framing our life as a journey towards a hopeful destination. The story it tells even has a narrator, an inner voice that chirrups away, performing a live improvisation of our autobiography. Neuroscientist Professor Michael Gazzaniga calls it the interpreter module. Its job, he writes, is to provide the storyline and the narrative of our life. It generates explanations about our perceptions, memories and actions and the relationships among them. This leads to a personal narrative, the story that ties together all the disparate aspects of our conscious experience into a coherent whole, order from chaos. This story may be completely wrong. It often is. That you are so proud of is a story woven together by your interpreter module to account for as much of your behaviour as it can incorporate, and it denies and rationalises the rest. A psychologically healthy brain excels at making its owner feel heroic. It does this by reordering our experiences, remixing our memories and rationalising our behaviour, using a battery of reality-warping weapons that make us believe we're more virtuous, more correct in our beliefs, and have more hopeful futures in store than others. For psychologist Professor Thomas Gilovich, the evidence is clear and consistent. We are inclined to adopt self-serving beliefs about ourselves and comforting beliefs about the world. The most powerful of these weapons is thought to be the moral bias. No matter what we do and how dishonestly we play, the brain nudges us to conclude we're ultimately a better person than most. In one study, participants guessed what percentage of time they exhibited a range of virtuous behaviours. 6 weeks later, they were asked again, but this time they were also shown the average ratings of other people. On the vast majority of behaviours, they rated themselves as much more moral than these normals. What they didn't realise was that the average ratings for others were, in fact, their own ratings from 6 weeks earlier. Another study, comparing people's self-image on a range of traits, found that virtually all individuals irrationally inflated their moral qualities. The researchers wrote, most people strongly believe they are just, virtuous and moral, yet regard the average person as distinctly less so. Moral superiority, they concluded, is a uniquely strong and prevalent form of positive illusion. Culture conspires in this dream of human life. Cultures are built out of billions of brains, billions of neural storytellers working in concert. They fill their religions, novels, newspapers, screens, speeches, gossip and ideologies with simplistic stories of moral heroes and evil villains, actors battling odds and fighting evil on their journeys towards promised lands. We all live the dream of the mind. To reveal the hidden structure of human life, we must burrow beneath the illusionary story of consciousness and into the subconscious, an incomparably more powerful place. It's in these mysterious deeps that the vast majority of the computation of life actually takes place. Despite how it feels, consciousness is not at the centre of the action in the brain, writes Eagleman. It is far out on a distant edge, hearing but whispers of the activity. The subconscious circuits that generate this hallucinatory story world were carved by natural selection to solve the problems that our ancestors faced during our species' evolutionary history. The human brain is specialised for the games we evolved to play. Neuroscientist Professor Chris Frith writes that it represents the world as a reward space. It's coded to discover the valuable things in the world and what actions we need to take to get them. Everything around me exerts a push or a pull because my brain has learned to attach value to them. As we've learned, humans value connection and status. In order to earn the resources essential for our survival and reproduction, we seek to bond with our co-players. In order to secure more of those resources, we seek rank. But how do we gauge this rank? How do we tell how we're doing in this game of life? We do it, in part, by assigning values to objects. A Cartier watch is worth this much status, a Casio watch is worth that. These status symbols tell us and our co-players how we're performing. We pay obsessive attention to them. We need to. Unlike in a computer game, there's no definitive scoreboard in human life. We can never see precisely where players sit versus us in the rankings. We can only sense it from symbols to which we've attached particular values. In order to manage this process, the subconscious has a status detection system that includes mechanisms that read relevant cues in the environment to assess status. This system is astonishingly sensitive. It doesn't only use inanimate objects as status symbols, it can project value onto virtually anything, including people's appearance and behaviours. Status symbolising acts in one study of office life included always carrying a folder, walking in a purposeful manner, even if only to the water cooler, and displaying multiple clocks. When all the vice presidents at a US corporation were issued with single-pen desk sets, one vice president shortly moved to a 2-pen set, and within 4 days, all vice presidents had worked their way up to 3-pen sets. People have been seen to become preoccupied with trivial phenomena they interpreted as symbolic of their status, such as the relative quantity of orange juice poured in their glass and negligible differences in clothing. In the luxury attire game, the general rule is the larger the logo, the lower the status and therefore price. One analysis found an increase in logo size of 1 point on a 7-point scale translates to a $122 price decrease for Gucci handbags and a $26 price decrease for Louis Vuitton handbags. The logo on Bottega Veneta's $2,500 hobo bag isn't visible. They put it on the inside. These apparently trite symbols matter. In one test, When participants were shown photos of people wearing rich or poor clothes, they automatically assumed those in wealthier-looking outfits were significantly more competent and of higher status. This effect remained when they were warned up front of the potential bias, when they were informed the clothing was definitely irrelevant, and when they were told all the people worked in sales at a mid-sized firm in the Midwest and earned around $80,000. It even remained when the participants were paid money to make an accurate guess. All it took for their status detection systems to make these extraordinarily stubborn judgments was a single flash of each photo, lasting 129 milliseconds. The status detection system continually reads symbolic information from the voice and body language of our co-players. It registers facial markers for dominance or submission in 43 milliseconds and calculates the quality and quantity of eye contact we're receiving, more is better, and it does so constantly, unconsciously, and with numerical precision. High-status people tend to speak more often and more loudly, are perceived to be more facially expressive, achieve more successful interruptions in conversation, stand closer to us, touch themselves less, use more relaxed open postures, use more filled pauses such as and ah, and have a steadier vocal tone, although some of these symbols may vary culturally. When researchers took candid photos of 96 pairs of co-workers interacting, cut them out and stuck them against a white background to remove contextual information, people were exceedingly accurate in their estimates of who had higher status. Merely by glancing at a still image of them talking, they could tell who was on top. The status detection system even reads symbolic information in sounds we can't consciously hear. When speaking, we emit a low-frequency hum at around 500 Hz. When people meet and talk, their hums shift. The highest status person in the group sets its level, and the rest adjust to match. This hum is thought to be an unconscious social instrument that helps us sort into status hierarchies. Analyses of interviews on The Larry King Show found the host deferentially changed his hum to match Elizabeth Taylor, whilst Dan Quayle adjusted to match him. The status detection system is highly evident in the behaviour of youngsters. Around 3/4 of arguments between children aged between 18 and 30 months are over possessions, a figure that rises to 90% when just 2 toddlers are present. For developmental psychologist Professor Bruce Hood, possession is a means to establish where you are in the nursery pecking order. The moment a toy is claimed by one child, other preschoolers want it. Owning stuff is all to do with status amongst competitors. These early disputes are a taster for later life in the real world. Just like the adults they'll become, these young status strivers are hypocritical. Children are sensitive to inequality, writes the psychologist Professor Paul Bloom, but it seems to upset them only when they themselves are the ones getting less. Infants become upset when handed fewer sugary treats than others. 5-year-olds seek relative advantage, often choosing to reject equal payouts of 2 prize tokens for everyone, preferring 1 token for themselves if it means others get none. Even in children, the inequality associated with relative advantage is so appealing that it overrides both a desire for fairness and a desire for absolute gain. What starts as fights over playroom toys grows into the great battles of adulthood. We're used to thinking of money and power as principal motivating forces of life, but they're symbols we use to measure status. Studies suggest that, unlike status, the desire for power over others is not fundamental in humans. Unlike status, it doesn't strongly predict well-being. Moreover, unlike status, the desire for power is quenchable. After acquiring a moderate amount of power, most people become less interested in gaining even more, writes sociologist Professor Cecilia Ridgway. But not so status. Likewise, the desire for wealth is not fundamental. Status is the original form of currency and the one that matters most. Studies show a majority of employees would accept a higher status job title over a pay rise. One survey of 1,500 UK office workers had around 70% choosing status over money, with creative assistants preferring Chief Imagination Officer and file clerks opting for data storage specialists. Those data storage specialists were onto something. Assuming we have enough money to live, it seems relative status makes us happier than raw cash. This has been found many times, with one study using data from 12,000 British adults concluding the ranked position of an individual's income predicts general life satisfaction, whereas absolute income and reference income have no effect. Elsewhere, economists find people's happiness goes down if others living nearby earn more than they do, and it drops most of all for those who spend time socialising in their neighbourhood. The effect is strong. An increase in neighbours' earnings and a similarly sized decrease in own income each have roughly about the same negative effect on well-being. This meets our understanding of how the brain works. It has to judge our status relative to everyone else's because that's how it perceives. For neuroscientist Professor Sophie Scott, perception has no ground zero. There's not an absolute truth about the world that we compare everything else to, so it's all relative. The status detection system, therefore, works in contest mode. Researchers find our reward systems are activated most when we achieve relative rather than absolute rewards. We're designed to feel best not when we get more, but when we get more than those around us. Some argue this is also true on the national level. As a country's average earnings go up, they say, average happiness doesn't. By the logic of the game, this makes sense. If everyone's getting richer at once, your extra pennies haven't bought you superior status. But the argument has been controversial. This is partly because nations are so complex, it's hard to cleanly isolate the link between economic growth and happiness. Some data, using cross-country evidence, does appear to show rising national income correlating with rising national happiness. But, according to happiness researcher Dr. Christopher Boyce, the increase is weak. That data just shows that economic growth is correlated, albeit very weakly, and not causally related, with higher life satisfaction. Statistically, whether it's across countries or across people living within the same country, there is nearly always an effect of having more money on happiness, yet the effect is not large at all. And so whilst money can buy happiness, much of the time it doesn't, or the effect is negligible. Meanwhile, academics at the University of Oxford's Wellbeing Research Centre find that, as you might expect, the less rich countries do see increases in happiness as the general standard of living improves. But for the already wealthy nations, over the long term, money makes surprisingly little difference. Between 1965 and 1990, the US economy grew by a healthy 1.7% a year, whilst Japan saw an impressive annual jump of 4.1%. In both nations, happiness barely budged. Money is a status symbol. Power is a status symbol, and so is the size of a logo on a handbag and the amount of orange juice poured in a glass. They're Pac-Man cookies in the game of human life. Humans are extraordinarily imaginative creatures who can turn almost anything into status symbols. In 1948, the anthropologist Professor William Bascom published an analysis of a status game on the Micronesian island of Pohnpei based on yams. Life there was like life everywhere, stratified into rankings. At the top were chiefs, with those beneath ordered along hereditary and political lines. Promotion to the upper ranks was difficult, but there was one rapid route to ascension. Men who brought yams to feasts hosted by the chiefs could win significant status. But the yam had to be big. A man cannot win prestige by bringing a large number of small yams to a feast, noted Bascom. The owner of the largest yam at a feast would be publicly declared number one by his rivals and praised by the chief for his generosity. Bascom found the men of Pohnpei in a state of symbolic war as they all competed to be number one. Each man would raise around 50 yams a year purely for feasts, growing them in secret, remote, overgrown plots they'd creep out of bed at 2 a.m. to tend to, lining their pits with soil and fertiliser until dawn. A single yam could take 10 years to grow, reach over 4 metres in length, weigh over 90 kilograms, and require as many as 12 men to carry into the feast using a special stretcher on poles. That Pohnpeians are able to grow yams of enormous size cannot be doubted, Bascom wrote. The reputation has spread at least as far as Truk, where yams are of minor importance. A delicate system of etiquette bloomed into life around these yam wars. It is impolite to look at another man's yams, and anyone caught doing so will feel the shame of gossip and ridicule, wrote Bascom. Pompeians go so far as to pretend to ignore even the yams growing near the house, which were there only to be eaten. When a man is named number one at a feast, he must not act proudly or boast openly about his achievement. When others discuss the merits of his yam, he pretends not to listen. This show of humility is partly a game-playing strategy. The man who is acclaimed number one does not dare to ridicule or laugh at the man with the second largest yam, or even the man who has brought the smallest one, for fear that they may bring larger yams than he does to the next feast. And if the challenger has not brought larger yams himself, he is publicly shamed. The yam game of Pompeii might sound ludicrous, but it's no different to the games any of us play using orange juice, watches, or fast walking in the office to symbolise status. In the 1950s, shortly after Bascom wrote his paper, vehicle manufacturers succeeded in persuading the US public that very long cars were a status game symbol. In one Dodge radio commercial, a man exclaimed, "Boy, you must be rich to own a car as big as this." Rivals Plymouth produced a print ad in which a family grinned by its extra-long vehicle. "We're not wealthy, we just look it." Ford's advert highlighted their engorged taillights, which let the people behind you know that you are ahead of them. Such appeals worked all too well. American cars became longer and longer. Great steel whales of the road began choking city traffic. Parking meters were torn up and spaced out at ever greater lengths. City governors beseeched manufacturers to make cars short again. Robert Wagner, the mayor of New York, declared they'd be buying no more Cadillacs until they were shrunk, only to be defied by his own city controller, who defended himself thusly. "The top officials of the city, for the dignity of their offices, should have Cadillacs." The status detection system never switches off. The game never pauses. This is why, especially in the public sphere, we can find ourselves playing hyper-local status games that are often fleetingly transient and can be between just two people. We might find ourselves playing a hyper-local game in a hotel lift that lasts 48 seconds. Who's an employee and who's a guest? Who's getting out at the plush top floors? Who's that person not giving me the respect I'm due by crowding into me? Who's got the flashiest luggage? Hyper-local games can pop up anywhere that people with a broadly agreed set of symbols gather. Australia's Bondi Beach is a status game with hyper-local rules, as is a self-help class, a nightclub, a queue for the bus, and a gang of friends sharing a meal. The anthropologist Professor Robert Paul writes that our pursuit of symbolic status has to do with the fact that human social life inherently depends on there being a public arena in which symbols can be made available to perception and shared by many people. People who have connected share in the perception of these symbols and incorporate them into their own thinking, feeling and identity, which means they experience their consociates as kin. It's in this way that we exist as a tribe, a culture, a people. We come into being as a collective when we connect with like-minded others whose brains process reality in similar ways, who dream the same dream of life. We recognise the same symbols, play the same game. As we do, we become the source of each other's status, the people of the yam. We see the yam, we know what it means, we experience a profound sense of connection with those who perceive this reality as we do. We play the yam game as a single organism, feeding one another's status when we judge it's been earned. Over decades of worry, strategy and toil, we pursue it, using shared symbols to build great kingdoms of meaning. These kingdoms, these virtual, connected, brain-generated hallucinations of reality, are the realms in which we exist. Our status game is a place. It's our neural territory, our world.